Last Thursday evening, I came home from my nursing shift at Riverside Medical Center to find my mother-in-law, Delilah Thornfield, had completely moved herself into my house without asking, rearranged all my furniture, thrown away half my belongings, and was cooking dinner in my kitchen like she owned the place. When I asked her what she was doing, she looked me dead in the eye and said, "Well, honey, this is my son's house too, and I've decided I'm moving in permanently to help you become a better wife." That was the moment I knew I had to take drastic action, and by Monday morning, Delilah found out exactly what happens when you mess with the wrong woman, because I had changed every single lock in the house while she was at her weekly bridge club meeting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. You guys, I cannot even begin to tell you the absolute chaos that unfolded after this. I'm Valentina Rodriguez, I'm 31 years old, and I've been married to my husband Jasper Thornfield for 3 years. We live in a beautiful 2-story colonial house in Maplewood Heights that we purchased together with our money. Both our names are on the deed, and we've worked incredibly hard to make it our sanctuary. Jasper works as a software engineer downtown, and I'm a registered nurse working 12-hour shifts at the hospital. We've got a solid marriage, we communicate well, and honestly, we were living our best life until Hurricane Delilah decided to blow into town and completely destroy our peace. Now, before I dive into this absolute nightmare, let me give you some context about Delilah Thornfield. This woman is 63 years old, recently divorced from Jasper's father after 35 years of marriage, and she has spent the last 2 years making it crystal clear that she believes no woman will ever be good enough for her precious baby boy. She lives in a gorgeous 3-bedroom condo in Willowbrook Estates that her ex-husband bought her as part of their divorce settlement, complete with a pool, walking trails, and a community center. This woman is not struggling financially, she's not homeless, and she absolutely did not need to move in with us. But Delilah has always been the type of person who believes the world revolves around her needs and desires. She's manipulative, she's controlling, and she has this incredible talent for making herself the victim in every single situation. When Jasper and I got engaged, she threw an absolute fit because we didn't ask for her permission first. When we planned our wedding, she tried to change our venue because she didn't like the color scheme. When we bought our house, she complained that we didn't choose a place closer to her condo. And don't even get me started on how she criticizes everything from my cooking to my career to the way I fold Jasper's laundry. The thing is, I've always tried to be respectful and maintain a good relationship with her because I love my husband, and I know family is important to him. I've bitten my tongue through countless passive-aggressive comments. I've smiled through her unwanted advice about how to properly take care of her son, and I've even invited her over for holidays and special occasions despite her constant criticisms. I genuinely tried to make peace with this woman, but apparently my kindness was seen as weakness, and she decided to take advantage of that in the most outrageous way possible. So here's what happened that completely changed everything. Jasper had been traveling for work. He was in Seattle for a 3-day tech conference, and I was pulling back-to-back shifts at the hospital because we were short-staffed due to flu season. I had worked a brutal 12-hour shift on Thursday, dealing with everything from emergency surgeries to difficult patients, and all I wanted was to come home, take a hot shower, order some Chinese takeout, and collapse on my couch with a glass of wine and my favorite Netflix show. But when I pulled into my driveway at exactly 7:15 in the evening, I immediately noticed something was off. The porch light was on, which was strange because I always turn it off when I leave for work, to save electricity. Then I saw that my living room curtains were open, and they're usually closed during the day for privacy. As I walked up to my front door, I could smell something cooking, which made absolutely no sense because Jasper wasn't supposed to be home until Friday afternoon. I used my key to open the front door, and I swear to you, I thought I had walked into the wrong house. My beautiful cream-colored sectional sofa had been moved to the opposite wall. My coffee table was gone completely, and there were boxes everywhere. My carefully arranged throw pillows were nowhere to be seen, My decorative candles had been replaced with some hideous ceramic figurines I'd never seen before, and my modern art prints had been taken down and replaced with old-fashioned floral paintings that looked like they belonged in a retirement home. I stood there in complete shock, trying to process what I was seeing, when I heard humming coming from my kitchen. I followed the sound, and there she was, Delilah Thornfield, wearing one of my aprons, cooking what smelled like pot roast in my slow cooker, using my dishes, and acting like she belonged there. She had completely rearranged my spice rack, moved all my appliances around, and there were grocery bags everywhere, with foods I would never buy. The moment she saw me, she smiled this sickeningly sweet smile and said, "Oh, perfect timing, sweetheart. I was just finishing up dinner. I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of improving your kitchen organization. You really had no system at all." And that, my friends, was just the beginning of the most insane week of my entire life. This story gets so much crazier, and I promise you're going to want to hear every single detail of what happened next, because the way this whole situation unfolded is absolutely unbelievable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Now here's the part that's going to absolutely blow your mind, because what I'm about to tell you makes this whole situation 10 times more outrageous than you could possibly imagine. Remember how I mentioned that Delilah had recently gotten divorced and was living in that gorgeous condo in Willowbrook Estates? Well, it turns out that wasn't exactly the whole truth, and the real reason she decided to invade my home is so much worse than I initially thought. See, when I confronted Delilah about what she was doing in my kitchen that Thursday evening, acting like she owned the place, she had this whole elaborate story prepared. She told me that she had been feeling incredibly lonely since her divorce, that she missed having family around, and that she thought it would be wonderful if we could all live together like one big, happy family. She went on and on about how she could help with cooking and cleaning, how she could take care of the house while Jasper and I were at work, and how this arrangement would benefit everyone involved. But here's what she conveniently forgot to mention during her little speech, and what I didn't find out until the next morning when I did some digging. Delilah had actually sold her condo in Willowbrook Estates 3 weeks earlier. Not because she was struggling financially, not because she couldn't afford it, but because she had been planning this whole invasion for months. She had deliberately sold her beautiful home, put all her furniture and belongings in storage, and had been staying in various hotels around town while she waited for the perfect opportunity to move into our house permanently. The woman had literally made herself homeless on purpose, just so she could manipulate her way into our lives and take over our home. She had planned this entire scheme, timing it perfectly for when Jasper would be traveling for work, and I would be exhausted from pulling double shifts at the hospital. She knew I would be too tired and caught off guard to immediately kick her out, and she was banking on the fact that by the time Jasper got home, she would already be settled in, and it would be harder for us to make her leave. But wait, it gets even more calculating and manipulative than that. When I started questioning her about her living situation and asking why she didn't just get another apartment or condo, Delilah revealed the most shocking part of her plan. She pulled out her phone and showed me a whole folder of screenshots and documents that she had been collecting for months. She had been researching tenant rights in our state, looking up laws about family members living together, and she had even consulted with a lawyer about what it would take to establish residency in someone else's home. This woman had done her homework. She knew that if she could prove she had been living in our house for 30 days, it would become incredibly difficult for us to legally remove her without going through a formal eviction process. She had planned to stay just under the radar long enough to establish legal residency, and then we would be stuck with her indefinitely. The scariest part? She had been watching our schedules for weeks, noting when we left for work, when we came home, and when Jasper had business trips planned. I found out later that she had even been talking to our neighbors, Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Chen, asking casual questions about our daily routines under the guise of being a, quote, concerned mother-in-law who wanted to surprise us with a visit. She had been gathering intelligence like some kind of domestic spy, planning every detail of her invasion to maximize her chances of success. And here's the absolute kicker. When I demanded to know how she had gotten into our house in the first place, Delilah smiled this smug little smile and pulled out a key. Not just any key, but a perfectly cut duplicate of our front door key. Apparently, during our last family barbecue 2 months ago, she had taken my keys from my purse while I was in the bathroom, driven to the nearest hardware store, made copies, and returned them before anyone noticed they were missing. She had been carrying around copies of our house keys for 2 months, just waiting for the right moment to execute her plan. The level of premeditation and violation of trust was absolutely staggering. This wasn't some spontaneous decision made out of loneliness or desperation. This was a calculated invasion that she had been planning and preparing for since early summer. When I asked her how she could possibly think this was acceptable behavior, how she could justify lying to us and violating our privacy and our home, she looked me straight in the eye and said something that I will never forget as long as I live. She said, "Valentina, dear, you're being very dramatic about this. Jasper is my son, and this house belongs to my son, which means it belongs to me too. I have every right to be here, and frankly, you should be grateful that I'm willing to help you learn how to properly take care of my boy." The audacity was absolutely breathtaking. She genuinely believed that because she was Jasper's mother, she had some kind of ownership rights to our home and our lives. She thought she could just waltz in, take over our space, rearrange our belongings, and we would somehow be thankful for the privilege of having her there. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly anticipated in all her careful planning and scheming, was that she had just messed with the wrong woman. Because while Delilah was busy congratulating herself on her brilliant plan, I was already formulating a plan of my own that would teach her exactly what happens when you try to steal someone's life. Let me take a step back and tell you exactly who I am and why the situation was so particularly devastating for me, because understanding my background will help you realize why Delilah's invasion wasn't just inappropriate. It was absolutely crushing to everything I had worked so hard to build for myself. My name is Valentina Rodriguez, and I am 31 years old. I grew up in a tiny apartment in East Brookfield with my single mother, Carmen, and my younger brother, Diego. My father walked out on us when I was 12, and Diego was 8, leaving my mom to work 3 jobs just to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table. I watched my mother clean office buildings at night, work at a grocery store during the day, and babysit neighborhood kids on weekends, all while going to community college to get her nursing degree because she was determined to give us a better life. Growing up, we never had our own space. We lived in cramped apartments with paper-thin walls where you could hear every argument from the neighbors, every footstep above us, and every car that drove by. Privacy was a luxury we couldn't afford. I shared a bedroom with Diego until I was 16, sleeping on a pull-out couch when relatives came to visit, and never having a single space that was truly mine. I remember dreaming about having my own room, my own bathroom, my own kitchen, where I could cook whatever I wanted without worrying about disturbing anyone else. When I graduated high school, I was determined to break the cycle of poverty and instability that had defined my childhood. I worked 2 part-time jobs while putting myself through nursing school at Pinecrest Community College, studying in hospital waiting rooms during my breaks as a patient transport aide, and pulling all-nighters to maintain my 4.0 GPA. I lived in a studio apartment that was barely bigger than a closet, surviving on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches, but I was so proud because it was mine. For the first time in my life, I had my own space, my own key, and nobody could take that away from me. After graduating with my nursing degree, I got hired at Riverside Medical Center in the intensive care unit, working the most challenging shifts with the sickest patients, because I wanted to prove myself and advance my career as quickly as possible. I saved every penny I could, driving a beat-up Honda Civic that broke down constantly, shopping at thrift stores, and eating homemade lunches every single day because I had a goal that kept me motivated through every sacrifice. That goal was to own my own home before I turned 30. Not rent, not lease, but actually own a piece of property that would be mine forever. I wanted a place where I could paint the walls any color I wanted, where I could plant flowers in my own garden, where I could invite people over without asking permission from a landlord, and where I could finally feel the security and stability that had been missing from my entire childhood. I met Jasper Thornfield when I was 26, and he was working as a junior software engineer at TechFlow Solutions downtown. He was kind, intelligent, hardworking, and most importantly, he understood my dreams, because he had grown up with similar struggles. His father had abandoned the family when Jasper was 15, leaving him, his mother Delilah, and his younger sister Rebecca to figure things out on their own. We bonded over our shared experiences of financial instability and absent fathers, and we both had this fierce determination to build something better for ourselves. Jasper and I dated for 2 years before getting engaged, and during that time we both worked incredibly hard to save money for our future together. He got promoted to senior software engineer, I picked up extra shifts and overtime whenever possible, and we lived in separate apartments while saving every dollar we could toward our shared goal of homeownership. We didn't go on expensive vacations, we didn't eat at fancy restaurants, and we didn't buy unnecessary luxuries because we were laser-focused on building our foundation. When we finally found our house in Maplewood Heights, it felt like a miracle. It's a beautiful 2-story colonial built in 1978, with 3 bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms, a spacious kitchen with granite countertops, hardwood floors throughout the main level, and a fenced backyard perfect for the children we hope to have someday. The asking price was $350,000, which was at the absolute top of our budget, but we fell in love with it the moment we walked through the front door. We spent months negotiating with the sellers, getting inspections, securing our mortgage, and handling all the paperwork. The day we closed on that house was honestly one of the happiest days of my entire life. I remember standing in our empty living room, holding our keys and crying tears of joy because I had finally achieved something I had been dreaming about since I was a little girl sleeping on that pull-out couch in East Brookfield. Over the past 3 years, Jasper and I have poured our hearts, souls, and every extra dollar into making this house our perfect home. We painted every room ourselves, refinished the basement into a cozy family room, planted a vegetable garden in the backyard, and carefully selected every piece of furniture to create a space that reflected our personalities and values. We hosted our first Thanksgiving dinner last year, and I still get emotional thinking about how proud my mother was when she sat at our dining room table and told me how far I had come. This house represents everything I have worked for, everything I have sacrificed for, and everything I hope to pass on to my future children. It's not just a building or an investment property. It's the physical manifestation of breaking generational poverty and creating the stable, loving home that I never had growing up. Every mortgage payment, every utility bill, every repair and improvement has been made possible by my 12-hour shifts at the hospital, dealing with life and death situations, comforting grieving families, and pushing through exhaustion because I know that every hour I work is an investment in our future. So when Delilah Thornfield decided to invade my sanctuary, rearrange my carefully chosen belongings, and claim ownership over the space that I had literally sacrificed years of my life to obtain, she wasn't just crossing boundaries. She was attacking the very foundation of everything I had built and everything I believed in. Now let me explain what our family dynamics were like before this whole nightmare began, because it's important for you to understand that while Delilah and I definitely had our differences, there was never any indication that she was capable of something this extreme and calculated. In fact, for the most part, we had managed to establish what I thought was a reasonably functional relationship, even though it required a lot of patience and compromise on my part. When Jasper and I first started dating, Delilah was actually going through her divorce proceedings with his father, Marcus Thornfield. Marcus had been having an affair with his secretary for over 2 years, and when Delilah finally found out, it completely shattered her world. The divorce was messy, expensive, and emotionally devastating for everyone involved, especially since they had been married for 35 years and had built their entire lives around each other. During that time, Jasper was incredibly worried about his mother's mental health and well-being. She had been a stay-at-home mom for most of their marriage, dedicating her life to raising Jasper and his younger sister Rebecca, managing the household, and supporting Marcus's career in real estate development. When the marriage fell apart, she suddenly found herself having to rebuild her entire identity and figure out how to live independently for the first time since she was in her 20s. I actually felt genuinely sorry for Delilah during this period. Despite some of her difficult personality traits, she was clearly struggling with depression, anxiety, and a complete loss of purpose. She would call Jasper at all hours of the day and night, crying about how lonely she felt, how betrayed she felt by Marcus, and how scared she was about starting over at 61 years old. As someone who had grown up watching my own mother struggle as a single parent, I understood how overwhelming it could be to suddenly have your entire support system disappear overnight. So I encouraged Jasper to be patient with his mother and to include her in our lives as much as possible during her transition period. We invited her to dinner at our apartment every Sunday. We included her in our holiday celebrations, and I even took her shopping a few times when she needed help picking out furniture for her new condo in Willowbrook Estates. I thought I was being a good daughter-in-law by showing compassion during one of the most difficult periods of her life. Delilah seemed to appreciate these gestures at first, and there were actually some moments where I thought we were developing a genuine friendship. She would bring me flowers from her garden, share family recipes that had been passed down through generations, and tell me stories about Jasper's childhood that made me fall in love with him even more. She even helped me plan Jasper's surprise 30th birthday party, and I was so grateful for her input and assistance with the decorations and catering. But as time went on and Delilah settled into her new life post-divorce, I started noticing some concerning patterns in her behavior. She began making subtle comments about how I was too career-focused, and how Jasper needed a wife who would prioritize family over work. She would criticize my cooking, suggesting that I should spend more time learning traditional recipes instead of relying on what she called modern shortcuts. She started giving me unsolicited advice about everything from my hairstyle to my choice of clothing, always framed as helpful suggestions, but delivered with a tone that made it clear she found me lacking. The comments became more frequent and more pointed after Jasper and I got engaged. Suddenly, every conversation seemed to include some reference to how the other women in their family had done things differently, how important it was to maintain certain traditions, and how marriage required sacrifices that she wasn't sure I was prepared to make. She would make these observations with a sweet smile and a concerned voice, but the underlying message was always the same. I wasn't good enough for her son. When we started planning our wedding, the tension really escalated. Delilah had very strong opinions about every single detail, from the venue, to the flowers, to the music, to the guest list. She insisted that we needed to include certain family traditions that felt completely foreign to me and my background. She wanted us to have the ceremony at the same church where she and Marcus had gotten married, even though neither Jasper nor I were particularly religious. She pushed for a formal sit-down dinner with assigned seating, while we wanted a more casual celebration that reflected our personalities. Every conversation about wedding planning turned into a battle of wills, with Delilah presenting her suggestions as non-negotiable requirements and becoming visibly upset when we chose different options. She would call Jasper separately to express her concerns about my decisions, putting him in the impossible position of having to choose between his mother's expectations and his fiancé's wishes. It was exhausting and stressful, and it definitely put a strain on our relationship during what should have been one of the happiest times of our lives. But even with all these challenges, we managed to get through the wedding planning process and have a beautiful celebration that incorporated some of Delilah's suggestions while still feeling authentic to who we were as a couple. I thought that once we were officially married and settled into our routine, the tensions would calm down and we could all adjust to our new family dynamic. For the first year or so, things did seem to improve. Delilah appeared to accept that Jasper and I were building our own life together, and she focused her energy on establishing herself in her new community. She joined a bridge club, started taking painting classes, and even began dating a widower named Harold, who lived in her condo complex. She seemed happier and more independent, and I was genuinely relieved that she was finding her own path forward. Our Sunday dinners continued, but they became more pleasant and less stressful. Delilah would share updates about her activities and ask about our work and our plans for the future. She still made the occasional comment about my housekeeping or cooking skills, but it felt more like harmless mother-in-law teasing rather than serious criticism. I started to think that maybe we had turned a corner in our relationship and that she was finally accepting me as part of the family. Jasper's sister Rebecca got married around this time, and Delilah threw herself into helping with those wedding preparations. I was actually grateful that she had another project to focus on, and I thought it was sweet how much effort she put into making Rebecca's day special. She seemed to genuinely enjoy having a role to play in the celebration, and it gave her a sense of purpose that had been missing since her divorce. Looking back now, I realize that I completely misread the situation. What I interpreted as Delilah finally finding peace and acceptance was actually her regrouping and strategizing. She was watching us, learning our patterns and planning her next move. The calm period wasn't because she had accepted our independence. It was because she was biding her time until she could find the perfect opportunity to reassert control over Jasper's life, and, by extension, our marriage. The first real warning sign that something was seriously wrong came about 6 weeks before Delilah's full-scale invasion, and I'm kicking myself now for not recognizing it as the beginning of her calculated plan. It started with what seemed like innocent requests for help, but looking back, I can see that she was testing boundaries and gathering information for her eventual takeover. It was a Tuesday morning in early September, and I was getting ready for my shift at the hospital when my phone rang. Delilah's name popped up on the screen, which was unusual because she typically didn't call during the week unless there was some kind of emergency. When I answered, she sounded distressed and explained that her kitchen sink had started leaking overnight and was flooding her bathroom below. She said she had called her building's maintenance department, but they couldn't get someone out until the following afternoon, and she was worried about water damage to her hardwood floors. Being the caring person that I am, I immediately offered to help her find a plumber, or at least come over after my shift to assess the damage. But Delilah had a different request. She asked if she could come stay at our house for just one night until her maintenance team could fix the problem. She said she didn't want to impose, but she was genuinely concerned about staying in her condo with water everywhere, and she thought it would be easier to just sleep in our guest room rather than booking a hotel. At the time, this seemed like a completely reasonable request. I mean, what kind of daughter-in-law would refuse to help her mother-in-law during a plumbing emergency? So I told her, of course, she could stay with us, and I even offered to pick her up after work so she wouldn't have to drive in the evening traffic. Jasper agreed that having his mother stay overnight was the right thing to do, and we both thought it would actually be nice to spend some quality time with her. When I arrived at Delilah's condo that evening to pick her up, I was surprised by how much stuff she had packed for what was supposed to be a single overnight stay. She had 2 large suitcases, a garment bag, a cooler full of food, and several shopping bags filled with what she described as essentials. When I commented on the amount of luggage, she laughed and said she was just being prepared in case the repair took longer than expected, and she didn't want to have to keep running back and forth to get things she needed. The first evening actually went really well. Delilah cooked dinner for all 3 of us, and we had pleasant conversations about work, current events, and family updates. She seemed genuinely grateful for our hospitality, and she was helpful with cleaning up after dinner and making sure she wasn't creating extra work for us. When it was time for bed, she settled into our guest room without any complaints, and I went to sleep thinking that maybe this little emergency would actually bring us closer together as a family. But the next morning, things started to feel a bit off. When I woke up for my early shift, I found that Delilah was already awake and had completely rearranged our kitchen. She had moved all the dishes to different cabinets, reorganized our pantry according to what she called a more logical system, and had thrown away several items from our refrigerator that she deemed expired or unhealthy. When I asked her about it, she said she had gotten up early and wanted to be helpful by tidying up, and she hoped I didn't mind that she had taken some initiative to improve our organization. I was honestly too tired and rushed to get into a discussion about it that morning, so I just thanked her for her help and headed off to work. But throughout my shift, I kept thinking about how presumptuous it was for her to completely reorganize our personal space without asking permission first. These weren't small adjustments. She had fundamentally changed where everything belonged in our kitchen, and it was going to take us weeks to remember where she had moved everything. When I got home that afternoon, I expected Delilah to be packing up her things and preparing to return to her condo now that her maintenance issue had presumably been resolved. Instead, I found her on our back patio, talking on the phone with someone about postponing some kind of appointment. When she finished her call, she explained that the plumber had discovered additional problems that would require more extensive repairs, and her building manager had recommended that she stay elsewhere for at least another 2 or 3 days while they dealt with potential pipe replacements and flooring repairs. Again, this seemed like a legitimate reason for extending her stay, and I felt bad that her simple leak had turned into such a major renovation project. But I started noticing other things that made me uncomfortable. She had unpacked all her clothes and hung them in our guest room closet as if she was moving in permanently. She had brought her own bedding and completely remade the guest bed with her preferred sheets and pillows. She had set up a small workspace in our living room with her laptop, papers, and personal belongings spread across our coffee table. Most concerning of all, she had started making changes to our daily routine without consulting us. She was up before both of us every morning, making breakfast according to her preferences and timing, rather than asking what we normally ate or when we typically left for work. She had started doing our laundry, but she was washing and folding everything according to her standards, which meant some of my delicate work clothes got damaged, and several of Jasper's shirts were ironed with creases in places where he didn't want them. When I tried to gently suggest that she didn't need to do so much work around the house, that we were perfectly capable of managing our own laundry and cooking, she became defensive and said she was just trying to be helpful and show her appreciation for our hospitality. She made comments about how busy we both were with our careers, and how she had so much more experience managing a household efficiently. She said she was actually enjoying having domestic responsibilities again after living alone for so long, and she hoped we would let her contribute to the family in meaningful ways. The 3 days turned into a week, and every day there was a new excuse for why she couldn't return to her condo yet. First, it was waiting for the insurance adjuster to assess the water damage. Then it was waiting for the flooring company to give them an estimate for repairs. Then it was waiting for the building management to approve the contractor's proposal. Each delay seemed plausible on its own, but the pattern was starting to make me suspicious. During that week, Delilah became increasingly territorial about our space and our routines. She started referring to our kitchen and our living room as if she had equal ownership of our home. She made grocery shopping lists that included only foods she preferred, and she started cooking meals that catered to her dietary restrictions and taste preferences, rather than considering what Jasper and I actually enjoyed eating. She even started answering our landline phone and taking messages for us, as if she was an official member of our household. By the end of that first week, I was feeling extremely uncomfortable and overwhelmed by having someone else controlling so many aspects of our daily life, but I didn't know how to address it without seeming ungrateful or unwelcoming. After all, she was supposedly dealing with a legitimate housing emergency, and she was genuinely being helpful with household tasks, even if her methods weren't exactly what we preferred. I kept telling myself that this was a temporary situation, and that once her condo repairs were finished, everything would go back to normal. But then Jasper got the notification about his business trip to Seattle, and I realized with growing dread that Delilah was going to be staying in our house while he was away, and I was working double shifts. That was when the real manipulation and boundary crossing began. After 2 weeks of watching Delilah systematically take over our home and our routines, I finally reached my breaking point and decided I had to have a direct conversation with her about boundaries and expectations. I had been hoping that she would naturally recognize when it was time to return to her own space, but it was becoming increasingly clear that she had no intention of leaving voluntarily, and her supposed condo repairs were starting to sound more and more fabricated with each passing day. The conversation happened on a Saturday morning when Jasper had gone to play golf with his college buddy Ryan, leaving Delilah and me alone in the house for the first time since she had arrived. I had been mentally rehearsing what I wanted to say for several days, trying to find a way to be firm about our needs while still being respectful and kind. I genuinely didn't want to hurt her feelings or make her feel unwelcome, but I also knew that if I didn't speak up soon, this temporary arrangement was going to become a permanent living situation that none of us had actually agreed to. I found Delilah in our kitchen, where she was preparing what she called a proper Saturday brunch, with elaborate egg dishes, homemade biscuits, fresh fruit arrangements, and fancy coffee drinks that required equipment she had somehow acquired and installed in our space. She was humming happily while she cooked, wearing one of my aprons, and moving around our kitchen with the confidence of someone who had been cooking there for years, rather than just 2 weeks. I took a deep breath and said, "Delilah, I was hoping we could talk about your living situation and maybe make a plan for transitioning you back to your condo." I tried to keep my tone casual and supportive, as if I was simply offering to help coordinate her move rather than asking her to leave our house. Her response was immediate and dramatic. She stopped what she was doing, turned to face me with a shocked expression and said, "Valentina, honey, what do you mean? I thought we were all enjoying this arrangement. I've been trying so hard to be helpful and contribute to the household, and I thought you appreciated having an extra pair of hands around here." When I tried to explain that while we certainly appreciated her help, Jasper and I were also looking forward to getting back to our normal routine and having our privacy restored, she became visibly upset. Her eyes filled with tears, and she started talking about how lonely she had been living by herself in the condo, how much she loved feeling like part of a real family again, and how devastating it would be to go back to rattling around in her empty space with nobody to cook for or care about. She said, "I know I'm probably being selfish, but these past 2 weeks have been the happiest I've felt since my divorce. I wake up excited to make breakfast for you, and Jasper, I love having people to talk to during the day, and I feel like I finally have a purpose again. Being here with you both has reminded me what it feels like to be needed and appreciated." The guilt trip was incredibly effective, and I found myself feeling terrible for even bringing up the subject. Here was this woman who had been through a devastating divorce, who was clearly struggling with loneliness and depression, and I was essentially telling her that her happiness and sense of purpose were inconvenient for me. What kind of person does that make me? But then she said something that made my blood run cold. She looked me directly in the eyes and said, "Besides, sweetie, I'm not sure you understand how much work it takes to properly maintain a household like this. You and Jasper are both so busy with your careers, and I can see how much stress you're under trying to manage everything. I think it would actually be beneficial for everyone if I stayed here permanently to help manage the domestic responsibilities." The word permanently hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't about temporary housing during emergency repairs anymore. This was about Delilah deciding that she wanted to move into our home and take over the role of household manager, whether we wanted her there or not. She was essentially proposing to become a live-in mother-in-law who would control our daily routines, our meals, our cleaning schedules, and probably every other aspect of our private life. I tried to stay calm and explain that Jasper and I had been managing our household just fine for 3 years, and while we appreciated her concern, we didn't actually need or want someone else taking over those responsibilities. I said that we valued our independence and our privacy, and we were looking forward to getting back to the routine that worked for us as a couple. That's when Delilah's mask really started to slip. Her sad, vulnerable expression transformed into something much harder and more calculating. She said, "Valentina, I think you're being very selfish and short-sighted about this. Jasper works incredibly long hours, and you're pulling double shifts at the hospital constantly. When are you supposed to have time for each other? When are you supposed to focus on building a real marriage and maybe starting a family? She continued, I've been watching you both these past 2 weeks, and I can see how exhausted and disconnected you are. You barely have conversations anymore, you're both too tired for intimacy or quality time, and your house is always a mess because neither of you has time to properly maintain it. You need help, whether you want to admit it or not. The audacity was breathtaking. She was basically telling me that my marriage was failing, that I was inadequate as a wife and homemaker, and that she needed to move in permanently to fix all the problems she had identified in our relationship and our lifestyle. She was positioning herself as the solution to problems that didn't actually exist, at least not from our perspective. When I tried to push back and explain that Jasper and I were perfectly happy with our life and our relationship, she interrupted me and said, Honey, I know you think you have everything under control, but I'm Jasper's mother, and I know him better than anyone. I can see the signs of stress and unhappiness even when he's trying to hide them. He needs more support at home, and frankly, you need someone to teach you how to properly care for a husband. That comment about needing to learn how to properly care for a husband was the moment I realized that this conversation was never going to be productive. Delilah wasn't interested in having a reasonable discussion about boundaries or timelines. She had already decided that she was moving in permanently, and she was prepared to justify that decision by criticizing my abilities as a wife and suggesting that our marriage needed her intervention to survive. I told her as calmly as I could that Jasper and I would need to discuss this as a couple, and that any decisions about long-term living arrangements would have to be made together. I said that while we appreciated her concern for our well-being, we were adults who were capable of managing our own relationship and our own household. Her response was to laugh. Actually laugh and say, Oh, sweetie, you don't need to discuss this with Jasper. I already talked to him about it yesterday, and he thinks it's a wonderful idea. He's just been too polite to bring it up with you because he knows how territorial you can be about the house. The claim that Jasper had already agreed to let her move in permanently was so shocking that I was literally speechless for several seconds. If this was true, it meant that my husband had been discussing major changes to our living situation behind my back and had decided to let his mother move in without even consulting me. If this was a lie, it meant that Delilah was willing to manipulate and deceive me in order to get what she wanted. Either way, I knew that the situation had escalated far beyond anything I could handle on my own, and I needed to have a very serious conversation with my husband about what was really going on. When Jasper returned from his golf game that afternoon, I was practically vibrating with anxiety and anger about my conversation with his mother. I had spent the entire day replaying every word she had said, trying to figure out whether she was telling the truth about him agreeing to let her move in permanently, or if this was just another one of her manipulation tactics. Either way, I knew I needed to get to the bottom of this situation immediately before it spiraled even further out of control. I waited until Delilah had gone upstairs to take what she called her afternoon beauty rest, before pulling Jasper aside for a private conversation. The moment we were alone in our bedroom with the door closed, I asked him point-blank whether he had discussed permanent living arrangements with his mother, and whether he had actually agreed to let her move in with us indefinitely. The look of complete confusion and shock on his face told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. He said, "What are you talking about, Val? Move in permanently? I thought she was just staying here until her condo repairs were finished. When did anyone mention anything about permanent arrangements?" The relief I felt knowing that Delilah had been lying to me was immediately replaced by fury, that she had been manipulating both of us and using our relationship as a weapon in her campaign to take over our home. I explained the entire conversation we had that morning, including her claims about him already agreeing to the arrangement and her criticisms of our marriage and my abilities as a wife. Jasper became increasingly angry as I recounted the details, especially when I told him about her comment that I needed to learn how to properly care for a husband. He said he was going to go talk to his mother immediately and set the record straight about what was and wasn't going to happen in our household. But when we went downstairs to find Delilah, we discovered that she had left the house without telling us where she was going or when she would be back. There was a note on the kitchen counter that simply said, "Gone to run some errands and visit with friends. Don't wait up for dinner. See you tomorrow morning. Love, Mom." The fact that she had disappeared right after our confrontation felt like a calculated move to avoid having to face the consequences of her lies and manipulation. It also meant that Jasper and I spent the entire evening stewing in our anger and frustration, unable to resolve the situation or get any clarity about her intentions and timeline for leaving. When Delilah returned to the house the next morning, she acted as if nothing had happened. She breezed into the kitchen with bags of groceries and started making what she called a peace-offering breakfast for everyone. She was cheerful and chatty, asking about our evening and sharing stories about her visit with her friend Eleanor from the bridge club. Jasper attempted to bring up the conversation I had reported to him, but Delilah immediately went into defensive mode and claimed that I had completely misunderstood what she was trying to say. She insisted that she had never used the word permanently, and that I was being overly dramatic about what had been a simple suggestion that she could be helpful around the house. When Jasper pressed her about claiming that he had already agreed to extended living arrangements, she said that she had simply been expressing her impression that he seemed happy to have her there, and that she thought he would be open to discussing different options for the future. She made it sound like I had twisted an innocent comment into some kind of conspiracy theory. The gaslighting was absolutely maddening. She was essentially telling us that the conversation I had reported never actually happened the way I described it, and that I was either lying or delusional about what she had said. She kept using phrases like, "I think you misheard me," and "that's not what I meant at all," and "you're reading way too much into this." But then she made a critical mistake that revealed her true intentions. While she was busy denying that she had ever suggested moving in permanently, she also started talking about all the improvements she wanted to make to our house to make it more functional for multiple generations living together. She mentioned wanting to convert our home office into a proper bedroom for herself, installing grab bars in the bathroom for safety, and rearranging the furniture in the living room to create better conversation areas. These weren't the suggestions of someone who was planning to leave in a few days when her supposed condo repairs were finished. These were the plans of someone who had already decided she was staying and was now focused on modifying our space to suit her preferences and needs. When Jasper pointed this out and asked her directly when she was planning to return to her own condo, Delilah's entire demeanor changed. The fake sweetness disappeared, and she became cold and defensive. She said that her repairs were taking much longer than expected, that she was having problems with her insurance company, and that she didn't appreciate being interrogated about her housing situation when she was going through such a difficult time. She then turned to me specifically and said, "Valentina, I'm really disappointed in how you've chosen to handle this situation. I thought we had developed a good relationship over the years, but it seems like you're more interested in creating drama and conflict than in supporting family during a crisis." The victim playing was incredible. She was somehow managing to position herself as the wronged party, even though she was the one who had been lying, manipulating, and invading our space without permission. She was making it sound like I was the problem for questioning her behavior and asking for reasonable boundaries. But the most infuriating part was when she looked directly at Jasper and said, "Honey, I hope you realize that this kind of behavior from your wife doesn't bode well for your future happiness together. A good wife supports her husband's family and makes sacrifices for the greater good, rather than creating unnecessary conflict over minor inconveniences." She was essentially telling my husband that I was failing as a wife because I didn't want his mother living in our house permanently, and that my objections to her invasion were evidence of character flaws that would damage our marriage. She was trying to drive a wedge between us by suggesting that any reasonable husband would side with his mother over his wife in this situation. That night, after another tense dinner where Delilah continued to act like nothing was wrong while simultaneously making passive-aggressive comments about ungrateful family members and selfish young people, Jasper and I had our first real fight about the situation. He was frustrated that his mother was putting him in an impossible position, but he was also worried about hurting her feelings or abandoning her during what might genuinely be a difficult time. I understood his conflicted feelings, but I was also reaching the end of my rope with the constant manipulation, gaslighting, and boundary violations. I told him that something had to change immediately, because I couldn't continue living in my own home feeling like a guest who was constantly being criticized and undermined. That's when Jasper told me about his upcoming business trip to Seattle, and I felt a sense of dread wash over me as I realized that Delilah and I were going to be alone in the house together for 3 days while I was working double shifts and completely exhausted. I knew that without Jasper there as a buffer, the situation was going to escalate dramatically, and I had no idea how bad things were about to get. Jasper left for his Seattle business trip on a Wednesday morning, and I could tell he was genuinely torn about leaving me alone with his mother for 3 days. Before he got in his Uber to the airport, he pulled me aside and promised that when he returned on Friday evening, we would sit down as a family and establish a clear timeline for Delilah to return to her own condo. He said he was finally ready to be firm with her about boundaries, regardless of how she reacted to the conversation. The first day went surprisingly smoothly. Delilah seemed to be on her best behavior, almost as if she knew she was walking on thin ice, and needed to prove that she could be a pleasant houseguest. She made breakfast for me before my shift, kept the common areas tidy, and even had dinner waiting when I got home from the hospital that evening. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope that maybe our previous confrontations had actually gotten through to her, and she was finally ready to respect our boundaries. But Thursday morning revealed the true scope of her plan, and I realized that her good behavior the day before had simply been the calm before the storm. When I woke up at 5:30 to get ready for my shift, I discovered that Delilah had been busy during the night. She had moved all of her belongings from the guest room into our master bedroom closet, hanging her clothes next to mine and Jasper's, as if she had every right to be there. She had rearranged our dresser drawers to make room for her undergarments and personal items, and she had even moved her toiletries into our private bathroom. When I confronted her about this completely unacceptable invasion of our most private space, she looked at me with this innocent expression and said, "Oh, honey, I hope you don't mind, but I thought it would be more practical for me to use the master suite since it has the larger closet and better lighting. The guest room is really quite cramped for someone who's staying more than just a few days." The casual way she said more than just a few days sent chills down my spine, because it confirmed that she had absolutely no intention of leaving our house anytime soon. But what made it even worse was her assumption that she could just take over our bedroom without asking permission, as if she had equal ownership of our most intimate space. I told her firmly that she needed to move her belongings back to the guest room immediately, because our bedroom was off limits and she had crossed a major boundary by entering our private space without permission. That's when her mask completely dropped, and I saw the real Delilah for the first time. She stood up straighter, crossed her arms, and said, "Valentina, I think it's time we had an honest conversation about what's really going on here. I know you've been trying to poison Jasper against me, and I know you've been looking for excuses to get rid of me because you're threatened by my relationship with my son." The accusation was so outrageous that I was momentarily speechless. I wasn't the one who had been lying, manipulating, and violating boundaries for the past 3 weeks. I wasn't the one who had moved into someone else's house without permission and then tried to take it over. But somehow, in Delilah's twisted version of reality, I was the villain who was trying to destroy family relationships. She continued, quote, "What you don't seem to understand is that I will always be the most important woman in Jasper's life. I gave birth to him, I raised him, I sacrificed everything for him, and that creates a bond that no wife can ever replace or compete with. You can try to turn him against me, but blood is thicker than water, and he will always choose his mother over some woman he's known for a few years." The way she said "some woman" with such contempt and dismissiveness made it clear that she had never seen me as a legitimate member of the family, despite 3 years of marriage and all my efforts to build a relationship with her. In her mind, I was just a temporary inconvenience who would eventually be replaced or sidelined, when Jasper came to his senses about where his real loyalty should lie. But then she said something that made me realize just how calculated and dangerous her plan really was. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "I've been watching you and Jasper for months, and I can see that your marriage is already starting to fall apart. You're both too focused on your careers, you never spend quality time together, and you're clearly not making his happiness a priority. It's only a matter of time before he realizes that he needs someone in his life who actually cares about his well-being." She was essentially telling me that she had been studying our relationship, looking for weaknesses and vulnerabilities that she could exploit to justify inserting herself into our lives permanently. She was positioning herself as the solution to marital problems that existed only in her imagination, and she was confident that she could convince Jasper that he needed her more than he needed me. Then came the threat that made my blood run cold. She said, "You can fight this all you want, but I'm not going anywhere. This house is big enough for all of us, and Jasper needs his mother in his life. You can either accept that and learn to get along with me, or you can keep creating drama and conflict until Jasper gets tired of dealing with your attitude and decides he'd be better off without you." She was basically giving me an ultimatum: accept her permanent presence in our home and our marriage, or risk losing my husband altogether. She was so confident in her ability to manipulate the situation that she genuinely believed she could force me to choose between having her as a permanent houseguest or losing my marriage entirely. When I told her that she was delusional if she thought Jasper would choose her over his wife, she laughed and said, "Oh, sweetie, you really don't know my son at all, do you? He's always been a mama's boy, and he always will be. When push comes to shove, he'll side with the woman who has been there for him his entire life, not the woman who's been making his life more difficult for the past few weeks." That afternoon, while I was at work dealing with a particularly challenging shift in the ICU, Delilah took her manipulation to the next level. She called Jasper in Seattle and told him that I had been increasingly hostile and unreasonable since he left, that I had accused her of terrible things, and that she was genuinely concerned about my mental health and stability. According to the text messages I received from Jasper that evening, Delilah had painted me as an irrational, jealous wife who was having some kind of breakdown and taking it out on his poor, innocent mother. She had managed to completely flip the narrative, making herself the victim and me the aggressor, even though she was the one who had been violating boundaries and making threats. When I tried to explain to Jasper over the phone what had really happened, he sounded confused and frustrated. He said his mother had seemed genuinely upset and worried when she called him, and he didn't understand why the situation was escalating so dramatically while he was away. He asked if we could all just try to get along for one more day until he got home and could mediate the situation in person. But I knew that waiting for Jasper to come home and play peacemaker wasn't going to solve anything. Delilah had shown her true colors, and she had made it clear that she was prepared to lie, manipulate, and destroy my marriage if that's what it took to get what she wanted. I realized that I was going to have to take drastic action to protect my home, my marriage, and my sanity before this situation got even worse. Friday morning brought what I can only describe as the most shocking and infuriating discovery of this entire nightmare. I had gotten up early before my final double shift, planning to have one last conversation with Delilah about moving her belongings back to the guest room and preparing for Jasper's return that evening. But when I went looking for her to have this discussion, I found something that made me realize just how deep her deception and manipulation actually went. I discovered Delilah in our home office, sitting at our computer with stacks of papers spread across the desk, talking quietly on the phone with someone about legal documents and residential rights. When she saw me in the doorway, she quickly ended her call and tried to shuffle the papers into a pile, but not before I caught a glimpse of what she had been working on. The documents scattered across our desk included printed copies of tenant rights laws for our state, information about adverse possession and squatters' rights, and most horrifying of all, a partially completed change of address form, with our home address listed as her new permanent residence. She had been researching the legal mechanisms she could use to establish herself as a legitimate resident of our home, and she was actively taking steps to make that change official. When I demanded to know what she was doing with these documents, Delilah initially tried to play innocent and claimed that she was just exploring her options, in case her condo repairs took longer than expected. But when I pressed her about the change of address form and asked her point-blank what her real intentions were, she finally dropped all pretense of being a temporary house guest in crisis. She stood up from our computer chair, looked me directly in the eyes, and said, "Valentina, I think it's time we stopped playing games with each other. Yes, I sold my condo 3 weeks ago. Yes, I planned this entire scenario to move in with you and Jasper. And yes, I fully intend to make this my permanent home, whether you like it or not." The casual way she admitted to orchestrating this entire deception was absolutely breathtaking. She confirmed that there had never been any plumbing emergency, no insurance complications, no repair delays. She had deliberately made herself homeless and then manipulated her way into our house with the specific goal of taking it over permanently. Everything she had told us for the past 3 weeks had been a carefully constructed lie. But then she revealed something even more disturbing. She pulled out her phone and showed me a folder of photographs she had been taking of our home, our belongings, and our daily routines. She had pictures of our mail, our utility bills, our work schedules written on our kitchen calendar, and even photos of me sleeping in our bed and Jasper getting dressed in the morning. She said, "I've been documenting my residence here for weeks, building evidence that I live in this house and contribute to the household. I have photos showing my belongings in every room, receipts for groceries I've purchased for the family, and records of all the domestic work I've been doing. If you try to kick me out, I have plenty of evidence to show that I'm an established resident with legal rights." The realization that she had been secretly photographing us in our own home, collecting evidence to use against us in some kind of legal battle, was so violating and creepy that I felt physically sick. She had been treating our private life like a surveillance operation, documenting everything she could use to support her claim that she belonged in our house. She continued, "I've also been keeping detailed records of every conversation we've had, every conflict you've initiated, and every example of what could be considered harassment or hostile behavior toward a vulnerable older woman who's trying to recover from a devastating divorce." She was essentially telling me that she had been building a legal case against me, positioning herself as a victim of elder abuse or discrimination who deserved protection and housing rights. She had been twisting every reasonable boundary I had tried to establish into evidence that I was somehow mistreating her. Then came the most shocking revelation of all. She opened her laptop and showed me a document that made my blood turn to ice. It was a draft of a formal complaint she was preparing to file with Adult Protective Services, claiming that I had been financially exploiting her, emotionally abusing her, and creating an unsafe living environment that was detrimental to her mental and physical health. The complaint included completely fabricated allegations that I had been demanding rent payments from her while she was vulnerable and homeless, that I had been verbally abusing her and threatening to throw her out on the streets, and that I had been isolating her from her son and preventing her from maintaining her family relationships. She had constructed an elaborate fictional narrative in which I was a predatory daughter-in-law who was taking advantage of a helpless elderly woman, and she was prepared to file this complaint with government agencies if I continued to resist her permanent residency in our home. She was essentially blackmailing me with the threat of false accusations that could destroy my nursing career and my reputation in the community. When I told her that everything in that document was a lie and that no one would believe her ridiculous accusations, she smiled this cold, calculating smile and said, "Oh, honey, you'd be surprised how seriously these agencies take complaints about elder abuse, especially when they come from a well-educated, articulate woman who has documentation to support her claims." She was right, and we both knew it. Adult Protective Services would be legally obligated to investigate any complaint she filed, regardless of how ridiculous or fabricated the allegations might be. The investigation alone would be devastating for my career, my marriage, and my standing in the community, even if I was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing. But the absolute worst part was when she revealed her ultimate plan. She said, quote, "What I'm offering you is actually quite generous. You can accept that I'm going to be living here permanently, and we can all learn to coexist peacefully as one big happy family. Or you can keep fighting me, and I'll make sure that everyone in your professional and personal life knows exactly what kind of person you really are. She was giving me a choice between accepting her permanent invasion of our home or having my life systematically destroyed through false accusations and legal harassment. She had spent weeks planning not just how to move into our house, but how to make it impossible for us to remove her without facing serious consequences. That afternoon, while I was at work trying to process this devastating conversation and figure out what to do next, Delilah took her manipulation to an even more outrageous level. She called my mother, my brother Diego, and several of our mutual friends to tell them that she was, quote, concerned about my mental health, and that I had been acting erratically and aggressively toward her during her stay with us. By the time I got home from my shift, I had received multiple worried phone calls and text messages from people asking if I was okay and expressing concern about the difficulties I was apparently having with Jasper's mother. She had managed to plant seeds of doubt about my stability and character in the minds of people who mattered to me, all while positioning herself as a caring family member who was worried about my well-being. That evening, as I sat in my own living room watching this woman who had invaded my home, violated my privacy, threatened my career, and tried to destroy my relationships with lies and manipulation, I realized that I had reached the point of no return. Delilah had made it clear that she would stop at nothing to achieve her goal of taking over our lives, and she was prepared to destroy me in the process if necessary. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I was going to take back control of my home and my life, and I was going to do it in a way that would send a clear message that her campaign of harassment and invasion was over. Saturday morning at 7 a.m., while Delilah was at her weekly bridge club meeting at the Willowbrook Community Center, I called Anderson Lock and Security and arranged for an emergency locksmith to come to our house immediately. I had made my decision during a sleepless Friday night, and I knew that if I was going to take action, it had to be swift and decisive before she returned from her social activities. The locksmith, a middle-aged man named Frank, arrived within an hour and efficiently changed every lock on our property: front door, back door, garage entry, and even the locks on our outdoor storage shed. I also had him install a new deadbolt system with keys that only Jasper and I would have access to. The entire process took less than 3 hours, and by 10:30 a.m., Delilah Thornfield was officially locked out of our home. But I knew that simply changing the locks wasn't going to be enough to end this nightmare, because Delilah had proven that she was willing to involve other people in her manipulation campaigns. So I spent the rest of Saturday morning preparing for the inevitable fallout by documenting everything that had happened and gathering evidence to support my side of the story. I printed out copies of all the legal documents I had found on our computer, including her tenant rights research and the draft Adult Protective Services complaint. I took photographs of all her belongings that were still in our house, proving that she had moved far more items into our space than anyone would need for a temporary emergency stay. I also wrote a detailed timeline of events, starting with her initial request to stay just one night, and documenting every lie, manipulation, and boundary violation that had occurred over the past 3 weeks. Most importantly, I called Jasper in Seattle and explained everything that had happened on Friday, including Delilah's confession about selling her condo and her threats to file false accusations against me. Jasper was absolutely furious when he learned the truth about his mother's deception, and he fully supported my decision to change the locks and prevent her from continuing to violate our home and our privacy. When Delilah returned from her bridge club meeting around 1 p.m. and discovered that her keys no longer worked, she completely lost her mind. I watched from our living room window as she stood on our front porch, frantically trying key after key, before beginning to pound on our door and ring our doorbell repeatedly. When I didn't answer the door, she started calling my phone over and over again, leaving increasingly hysterical voicemails demanding that I let her back into her home immediately. In one particularly unhinged message, she screamed that I had illegally locked her out of her legal residence, and that she was going to call the police to force me to give her access to her belongings. True to her word, within 2 hours of discovering the changed locks, 3 police officers arrived at our house to conduct what they called a The officers were professional and courteous, but they explained that they were legally required to investigate any report involving potential theft or illegal possession of someone else's property. I invited them inside and showed them all the documentation I had prepared, including the timeline of events, photographs of Delilah's belongings, and copies of the legal documents she had been preparing to use against us. Officer Martinez, the senior officer on the scene, reviewed everything carefully and asked detailed questions about the living arrangements and how long Delilah had been staying in our house. When I explained that she had originally requested one night of emergency housing due to a fabricated plumbing crisis, and had then systematically lied about repairs and insurance delays to extend her stay indefinitely, he nodded knowingly and said they saw similar situations more often than people might think. The officers determined that since Delilah had never paid rent, had never signed any kind of lease agreement, and had been staying in our home as a guest rather than a tenant, she had no legal claim to continued access to our property. They explained that as the homeowners, Jasper and I had every right to deny her entry to our house, and that changing our locks was completely legal and appropriate. However, they also explained that we were legally required to allow her to retrieve her personal belongings, and they offered to supervise this process to ensure that it was conducted peacefully and without further conflict. I agreed to this arrangement, and we scheduled a time for Delilah to collect her things the following day, when Jasper would be home from his business trip. But Delilah wasn't satisfied with this reasonable resolution. Over the course of Saturday afternoon and evening, she launched a full-scale campaign to rally family members and friends to her side, calling everyone she could think of to tell them her version of events and seek support for her position. She called Jasper's sister Rebecca, sobbing that I had thrown her out on the streets and claiming that she was now homeless with nowhere to go. Rebecca immediately called Jasper in a panic, demanding to know why he was allowing his wife to treat their mother so cruelly, especially when she was still recovering from her devastating divorce. Jasper had to spend over an hour on the phone with Rebecca, explaining the real timeline of events and sharing some of the evidence I had gathered about their mother's deception and manipulation. Rebecca was shocked to learn that the emergency housing situation had been completely fabricated, and that Delilah had been secretly planning this invasion for months. Delilah also called her ex-husband Marcus, despite the fact that they had barely spoken since their divorce was finalized. She told him that his son and daughter-in-law were abusing and abandoning her, and she needed his help to find legal representation to protect her rights. Marcus, who had been dealing with his own guilt about the affair that ended their marriage, initially agreed to help her find a lawyer. But when Marcus called Jasper to get his side of the story, he quickly realized that Delilah was up to her old manipulative tricks. Marcus told Jasper that one of the main reasons their marriage had failed was because Delilah had a pattern of creating drama and conflict when she didn't get her way, and that she had frequently used emotional manipulation to control family situations. Most surprisingly, Delilah called my own mother, Carmen, claiming that she was, quote, concerned about my mental health, and suggesting that I was having some kind of breakdown that was causing me to act irrationally toward my family members. My mother, who had always been polite but distant with Delilah, listened to her concerns and then called me to get the real story. When I explained everything that had actually happened, including the surveillance photos and the threats to file false accusations, my mother was absolutely livious. She had grown up in poverty and knew what it was like to have people try to take advantage of your kindness and generosity. She told me that I had done exactly the right thing by protecting my home and my marriage, and she offered to come stay with us for a few days if I needed moral support. Even Delilah's bridge club friends started questioning her story when she showed up at their weekly game visibly distraught, and claiming that her, quote, cruel daughter-in-law had locked her out of her home without warning. Her friend Eleanor, who had known Delilah for several years, pointed out that she had never mentioned living with her son and daughter-in-law before, and asked why she hadn't simply returned to her own condo if there was a family conflict. When Delilah had to admit that she had sold her condo weeks earlier, Eleanor and the other women began asking more pointed questions about the timeline and circumstances of her housing situation. Several of them privately told Eleanor that Delilah's story didn't make sense, and they suspected there was more to the situation than she was revealing. By Sunday morning, when Jasper finally returned from Seattle, the initial wave of sympathy and support that Delilah had tried to generate was already starting to crumble, as people learned more details about what had really happened and began to question her version of events. When Jasper walked through our front door Sunday evening, using his key that still worked perfectly in our new locks, I felt a mixture of relief and overwhelming emotional exhaustion that I hadn't fully prepared myself for. The past week had been the most stressful and traumatic experience of our entire marriage, and even though I knew I had done the right thing by changing the locks, I was suddenly hit with a wave of doubt about whether I had handled the situation correctly. The supervised retrieval of Delilah's belongings that afternoon had been emotionally brutal, even with Officer Martinez present to keep things civil. Delilah had arrived with a rented moving truck and 2 men from a local moving company, which seemed excessive for someone who was supposedly just collecting a few emergency items from a temporary stay. But when we started going through her possessions, it became clear that she had accumulated an enormous amount of stuff during her 3-week residence in our home. In addition to the clothes and personal items I expected, she had somehow acquired new furniture pieces, kitchen appliances, decorative objects, and even gardening tools that she claimed belonged to her. When I questioned some of these items that I was certain had been in our house before her arrival, she insisted they were things she had purchased for the household as contributions to our shared living expenses. The most disturbing discovery was a box of documents she had hidden in our basement, including printed emails between her and various family members dating back months before her supposed plumbing emergency. These emails revealed that she had been complaining about feeling excluded from our lives and expressing frustration that we didn't include her in our daily routines and decision-making processes. In one particularly telling exchange with her sister Patricia, Delilah had written, "I don't understand why Jasper thinks he needs to prioritize his wife's opinion over his mother's wisdom. I raised him to be a good man, and now this girl is trying to turn him against his own family. Something needs to be done before their marriage completely isolates him from the people who really matter." Reading these emails made me realize that her invasion of our home wasn't just about loneliness or post-divorce trauma. She had been actively planning to disrupt our marriage and reassert her control over Jasper's life for months before she ever made that first phone call about needing emergency housing. The whole elaborate scheme had been motivated by jealousy and a deep resentment about losing her position as the primary woman in her son's life. During the retrieval process, Delilah made several attempts to engage me in emotional conversations about forgiveness and family loyalty. She kept saying things like, "Valentina, I hope you realize that all of this could have been avoided if you had just been more welcoming and understanding," and quote, "I never intended for things to escalate this way, but you forced my hand by being so hostile and unreasonable." Even with everything I knew about her manipulation tactics, part of me started wondering if I had been too harsh or inflexible. Maybe I could have tried harder to find a compromise that would have allowed her to stay temporarily while genuinely looking for alternative housing. Maybe I should have been more patient with her emotional needs during such a difficult transition period in her life. These doubts became even stronger when Jasper's sister Rebecca arrived unannounced Sunday evening, clearly upset and wanting to discuss the family situation. Despite Jasper's explanation of the real facts, Rebecca was still struggling to reconcile the mother she thought she knew with the calculated manipulator who had been exposed over the past week. Rebecca said, "I know Mom can be difficult and controlling sometimes, but I've never seen her do anything this extreme or deceptive. Are we sure there isn't some kind of mental health issue going on here? Maybe she's having some kind of breakdown from the divorce trauma and not thinking clearly about boundaries and appropriate behavior. The suggestion that Delilah might be suffering from mental health problems that were causing her to act irrationally made me question whether I should have been more compassionate and understanding. If she was genuinely struggling with depression, anxiety, or some other psychological condition related to her divorce, then maybe her behavior wasn't entirely intentional or malicious. Jasper was firm in his response, pointing out that the level of planning and calculation involved in Delilah's scheme indicated that she was thinking very clearly and making deliberate choices about how to manipulate the situation. He said that while her divorce had certainly been traumatic, it didn't excuse months of lying, boundary violations, and threats to destroy our lives if we didn't comply with her demands. But Rebecca's concerns planted seeds of doubt in my mind about whether we had exhausted all possible alternatives before resorting to what she called the nuclear option of changing the locks and forcing a confrontation. She suggested that we could have tried family counseling, or asked other relatives to intervene, or given Delilah more time to find alternative housing solutions. Monday morning brought a phone call from Delilah's lawyer, a woman named Sandra Kellerman, who specialized in elder law and family disputes. Ms. Kellerman explained that she had been retained to explore potential legal remedies for what Delilah was characterizing as an illegal eviction and destruction of her established residency rights. While Ms. Kellerman was professional and courteous, she made it clear that Delilah was prepared to pursue legal action if we didn't agree to allow her to return to our home and establish a formal residential arrangement. She mentioned the possibility of filing complaints with Adult Protective Services, pursuing civil litigation for emotional distress and housing discrimination, and seeking restraining orders that would prevent us from interfering with her access to what she considered her legal residence. The threat of prolonged legal battles and potential damage to our reputations in the community was terrifying, and I started questioning whether my decision to change the locks had actually made things worse rather than better. Maybe I should have continued trying to reason with Delilah and find a peaceful solution that would have avoided escalating the conflict to this level. That evening, I had a complete emotional breakdown in our bedroom, crying and questioning whether I was the terrible daughter-in-law that Delilah had painted me as in her conversations with family and friends. I started wondering if my own childhood experiences with poverty and instability had made me too territorial and defensive about our home, and whether a more secure person would have been able to handle the situation with more grace and flexibility. Jasper held me while I cried and reminded me of all the evidence we had gathered about his mother's calculated deception and manipulation. He said that even if she was struggling with mental health issues, that didn't give her the right to violate our boundaries, threaten our careers, or try to destroy our marriage when she didn't get her way. But the doubt continued to gnaw at me throughout the week. I found myself constantly second-guessing my decisions and wondering if there had been warning signs I should have recognized earlier, or if I could have handled the initial conversations differently to prevent the situation from escalating so dramatically. The worst part was wondering whether this whole nightmare had permanently damaged our relationship with Jasper's family, and whether I would always be seen as the daughter-in-law who threw her mother-in-law out on the streets during her time of need. Even though I knew the real facts about what had happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that some people would always question my version of events and wonder if I had been unnecessarily cruel or heartless. It wasn't until I went back to work at the hospital and started talking to my colleagues about the situation that I began to regain some perspective about what had actually happened. Several of my fellow nurses shared their own stories about difficult family members who had tried to take advantage of their kindness, and they all agreed that I had done exactly what any reasonable person would do when faced with such extreme manipulation and boundary violations. My supervisor, Janet, who had been a nurse for over 20 years, told me that she had seen countless situations where people's mental health and marriages had been destroyed by family members who refused to respect boundaries and insisted on controlling other people's lives. She said that protecting your home and your marriage wasn't selfish or cruel. It was necessary for survival and well-being. 6 months have passed since I changed those locks, and I can honestly say that it was one of the best decisions I've ever made for my marriage, my mental health, and my overall well-being. But I know that many of you watching this are probably wondering what happened next, whether Delilah followed through on her legal threats, and how our family relationships have evolved since this whole nightmare unfolded. Let me start with the legal situation because I know that's probably the first thing you're curious about. Delilah's lawyer, Sandra Kellerman, did initially file a complaint with Adult Protective Services, just as she had threatened to do. The investigation was exactly as stressful and invasive as I had feared it would be, with social workers interviewing me, Jasper, our neighbors, and several of my colleagues at the hospital about my character and my treatment of elderly family members. However, the investigation was also surprisingly thorough and professional. The APS caseworker, a woman named Maria Santos, quickly realized that Delilah's allegations didn't match the documented timeline of events or the physical evidence we were able to provide. When Ms. Santos reviewed the emails we had discovered, the photographs Delilah had taken without our permission, and the legal documents she had been preparing to establish residency, it became clear that this was not a case of elder abuse, but rather an attempted fraud and manipulation scheme. The most damaging evidence against Delilah's case was actually her own documentation. Remember those detailed records she had been keeping about our household routines and her contributions to domestic work? It turns out that when you're trying to claim someone is financially exploiting you and preventing you from maintaining family relationships, having hundreds of photos of yourself comfortably living in their home and participating in family activities actually works against your story rather than supporting it. Ms. Santos closed the investigation within 6 weeks and actually commended us for handling a difficult family situation with patience and appropriate boundaries. She told us that they see cases like this more often than people realize, where family members try to use the elder protection system to resolve housing disputes or gain leverage in personal conflicts. As for the threatened civil litigation, Delilah's lawyer quietly dropped those plans once she realized how much evidence we had of her client's deception and premeditation. Ms. Kellerman actually called Jasper directly to apologize for the harassment and explained that she had initially believed Delilah's version of events, but once she reviewed all the documentation, she realized that pursuing legal action would likely result in counterclaims for harassment, trespassing, and possibly fraud. The most surprising development was learning that we weren't Delilah's first targets for this type of manipulation. During the APS investigation, Ms. Santos discovered that Delilah had attempted similar schemes with 2 other family members over the past year. She had tried to move in with her sister Patricia by claiming her condo was being fumigated for bedbugs, and she had attempted to establish residency with her cousin Margaret by saying she needed a place to stay while recovering from a minor surgical procedure. Both Patricia and Margaret had eventually asked her to leave when her temporary stays began extending indefinitely, but neither of them had realized that the emergencies were fabricated or that she was systematically targeting family members for housing manipulation. When they learned about what had happened with us, they both reached out to share their own experiences and expressed relief that someone had finally documented her behavior pattern. This revelation completely changed how our extended family viewed the situation. Rebecca, who had initially been sympathetic to her mother's claims of mistreatment, was horrified to learn that Delilah had been systematically lying to and manipulating multiple family members for over a year. She apologized to both Jasper and me for questioning our account of events, and admitted that she had been enabling her mother's behavior by always giving her the benefit of the doubt. Even more importantly, Rebecca and her husband decided to establish clear boundaries with Delilah moving forward, including a rule that any requests for housing assistance would need to be discussed with other family members and verified through independent sources. They also insisted that Delilah attend counseling to address what they called her boundary and honesty issues, if she wanted to maintain relationships with her children and grandchildren. As for Delilah herself, the consequences of her failed manipulation campaign have been significant and long-lasting. She ended up having to use a substantial portion of her divorce settlement to rent a furnished apartment in a different part of town, since her behavior had burned bridges with most of the family members she had been counting on for support. More importantly, her reputation in her social circles was severely damaged when the truth about her fabricated emergencies became known. Several members of her bridge club and her painting class learned about the situation through the family grapevine, and many of them began questioning other stories she had told them about family conflicts and health crises. Jasper and I have established a strict no-contact policy with Delilah, which has been both liberating and occasionally difficult to maintain. We don't attend family events where she's present, we don't accept phone calls or messages from her, and we've made it clear to other family members that any attempts to pressure us into reconciliation or forgiveness will result in reduced contact with them as well. This boundary has been tested several times, particularly during holidays and special occasions, when well-meaning relatives have suggested that enough time has passed, or that we should let bygones be bygones for the sake of family unity. But we've remained firm in our decision because we learned the hard way that Delilah views any compromise or kindness as an invitation to resume her manipulation tactics. The impact on our marriage has actually been overwhelmingly positive, despite the initial stress and conflict. Going through this experience together taught us how to communicate more effectively about difficult situations, how to support each other when facing external pressure and criticism, and how to prioritize our relationship and our home above the expectations and demands of extended family members. We've also become much better at recognizing manipulation tactics and setting appropriate boundaries with difficult people in other areas of our lives. The skills we developed during this crisis have helped us handle workplace conflicts, neighborhood disputes, and even challenging situations with some of our friends more effectively and confidently. Now I want to hear from all of you, because I know that family boundary issues are something that so many people struggle with, and I'm curious about your experiences and perspectives. Have any of you dealt with family members who tried to take advantage of your kindness or manipulate their way into your homes and your lives? How did you handle it, and what advice would you give to someone who's facing a similar situation? I'm also really interested to know what you think about the balance between family loyalty and personal boundaries. Do you think I was too harsh in cutting off contact with Delilah completely? Or do you think that some behaviors are so extreme that they warrant permanent consequences? Should I have given her more chances to apologize and change her behavior? Or was the pattern of manipulation too established to justify continued attempts at reconciliation? And for those of you who might be dealing with similar situations right now, I want you to know that you're not alone and you're not crazy for feeling overwhelmed or confused when family members cross major boundaries. Trust your instincts, document everything, and don't be afraid to seek help from professionals or law enforcement when someone's behavior becomes threatening or dangerous. If this story resonated with you, or if you have your own family drama experiences to share, please leave them in the comments below. I read every single comment, and I love hearing from you about how these situations have played out in your own lives. Your stories and support mean everything to me, and they help other viewers realize that they're not alone in dealing with difficult family dynamics. Also, if you want to see more content about family boundaries, relationship red flags, or standing up for yourself in difficult situations, please let me know by hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. I'm always looking for new topics that you're interested in discussing, and your engagement helps me understand what kind of content is most helpful and relevant to your lives. Thank you so much for listening to this incredibly personal and difficult story. And remember that you have the right to protect your home, your marriage, and your peace of mind, no matter what anyone else tells you about family obligations or forgiveness. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's destructive behavior, even when that someone is family. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.